Hey everybody, what's going on? Hellmite here, bringing you another video from Grab the Lantern today. Today I wanted to talk about Bronzodia, which for those of you who are unaware is a very old concept in League of Legends at this point, I think dating all the way back to Season 2 and 3, which essentially is a set of 5 champions who, if picked, automatically won the game for their bronze level team. Obviously a reference to Yu-Gi-Oh's Exodia card, which is a set of 5 pieces that won you the game automatically. Now, while I want to talk about these champions both in terms of the sort of nostalgia trip that I do think that they bring up, but also just in generally because these champions can give us an idea of what low-level players struggle with, and tips for how to improve our own game and sort of things to keep in mind when we are playing the game in the future, and sort of why these champions ended up being quite so powerful and with the reputation that they have. Now, the Bronzodia pieces, at least historically back in the day, were Malphite, Amumu, Alistar, Shen, and Blitzcrank. And while those champions have all received changes of some degree to another, they still all have the same attributes in today's League of Legends that made them into Bronzodia and sort of kept them in the same place that they are today. So I do think it's still relevant to talk about. First and foremost of these champions, as you may or may not have noticed, they are all tanks. And the biggest reason for this, and why that sort of is a common thread among Bronzodia champions, is that initiation is super powerful, and a lot of lower ranked or inexperienced players underrate the value of having hard initiation. Obvious teamfight setup is super powerful, both because of how much value you can get out of something like a Malphite R or Alistar WQ on multiple team members, or even just one team member if they're important enough, but also because it's an obvious signal to the rest of your team that a fight is starting. I can't think of how many times teams with sort of less obvious initiation variants have sort of struggled to realize, okay, well, are we fighting or aren't we fighting? They sort of don't get it, right? Something like an Ashe R onto an important enemy team member. Sometimes teams say, well, okay, the Ashe hit the R, but were they looking for a pick? The whole rest of the enemy team is there. Do we still want to fight this regardless? And they sort of don't understand that, like, yes, that is an initiation. We can fight that because the enemy AD carry is stunned for, 3 seconds. We can totally walk at them and kill them while they're stunned and force the enemy team into a bad situation. That's sort of a tricky situation to figure out, or something like Gangplank ulting an enemy team. Again, it's sort of hard to understand if that is an initiation, if that's the go button, are we going all the way in, or if that's just sort of the Gangplank pressing R for maybe he's R'ing for poke, maybe he's R'ing because he saw a low health champion, who actually knows how that's going on. So having the ability to press R on Malphite, everyone knows what that means, right? Everyone knows if Malphite presses R, that's a go button, or if Amumu presses R, that's a go button. So having an obvious signal to the rest of your team that you are starting a fight is super, super strong, and it's something that almost all of these champions bring to the table. Everyone knows what the Malphite wants when he presses R and goes all the way in. And this sort of brings me to my next point, which is that crowd control is super, super powerful in League of Legends. The ability to say to a champion, you don't get to play the game for a second or a couple of seconds, is a very, very strong ability to have, and something that you can definitely bring to the table, and that is quite powerful. But a lot of players, especially at lower ranks again, or who are more inexperienced, they want mobility or damage out of a champion because those are a lot more fun, right? If you think of the kinds of champions that have high mobility, high damage, we tend to think of champions like Lucian or Yasuo or Ezreal, Zed, Akali, right? All these champions who very much so are like, I want to be dashing around, doing high amounts of damage, getting all the kills, and basically carrying my team thanks to these kills that I'm acquiring, right? And a lot of players as well, this sort of builds into a lot of low-ranked players sort of always seeing themselves as the carry in all situations, regardless of how well they're doing. Even if you're going 0-3 on someone like a Zed, well, you're still the Zed, you're still the carry, so, you need to be trying to make these big plays, because so as a result, a lot of players then pick these champions, and important to note here as well, because you're picking champions with both mobility and damage, these champions tend to be very light on crowd control. That's one of the sort of triangles of champion design that kind of says you're not allowed to have, high mobility, high damage, and high crowd control as well, because that sort of breaks part of the game where you're able to both CC people, you have utility, there's a lot you're able to do if you sort of have all of these assets combined, right? So if you're going to be picking champions with high Bronzodia champions, all have reliable crowd control, which not only is useful in all situations, even if they're behind, even if that Malphite's going 0-3 in lane, he can still press R for value, but it also punishes these high mobility, high damage dealing champions favored by the rest of the meta, especially given that those champions are super squishy. So you don't have to one-shot someone as Malphite in order for that to be valuable, because just crowd controlling the enemy Akali for, you know, a second and a half or whatever it ends up happening to be, can be enough for the rest of your team to dump their damage on that crowd controlled target. A lot of players who are less experienced don't have the reaction times to dodge these kind of reliable crowd control effects. Like an Amumu flash R is practically unavoidable if he's in range, and Malphite R can be really difficult to dodge, especially if he's able to either come out of Fog of War or not have to do a maximum range unstoppable force, which makes them extra valuable at low levels of play, because unlike in pro play where you can reliably think of pros who are flashing out of the way of Malphite R or otherwise using mobility to avoid it, it's a lot harder for a bronze or iron player to use their reaction time to make use of that, right? They just don't have that developed yet. So again, that's sort of a second reason why these champions are very powerful, and it sort of highlights the advantage of having reliable crowd control and champions that can play from behind in your games, right? These champions are valuable because they're always good, and they do bring an important asset to your team. Even if they're not doing the most damage on the team, the fact that they can say, hey, your champions are not moving during this team fight is very, very powerful. This also builds into positioning, how important that can be for lower ranked players especially. They have a looser understanding of what positioning means and how it's important. They kind of just want to play up, look for aggressive plays. You know, they don't really sort of understand where they should be standing or where they should be playing, right? And because of that, they play up, they look for these aggressive skill shots, they're always trying to trade damage no matter what happens, and those positioning mistakes, right, stepping up to a minion wave that you shouldn't be walking up to or straying in front of your tanks, it can result in really easy punishes from stuff like Blitzcrank Q or Malphite R, because they sort of say, oh, the enemy carry's walking at me, alright, I'll just R him, or I'll just throw the Q out, and if I land it, then they're dead, and we win that team fight straight off the bat. And that sort of builds into Blitzcrank as well, who I do want to talk about a little bit here, because he's in particular worth highlighting because players don't really know the counterplay to hook, right? He doesn't really have the sort of hard initiation that I've been talking about, though he does have some reliable crowd control in the form of Power Fist and Static Field. But in particular, I think he's worth highlighting because players don't know the counterplay to his hook, right? Which essentially is that if he whiffs in lane, you can punish him for that, right? Like, Blitzcrank doesn't have anything else he can do in that situation if he's already used his hook. You know, he's probably waiting for 20 or so seconds in order to actually get that cooldown available and try to use that again to set up a play. So especially in lane, you know, players don't get that, yeah, he's used hook, he's no longer scary, you can just walk at him and you'll be fine. And so that ends up being a reason why Blitzcrank tends to be a reliable pick at lower levels, because he doesn't have to actually hit the hooks. He doesn't have to sit on it all lane and do nothing else except be dangerous because of the threat of hook. He can throw it out off cooldown because players aren't going to punish him for it, and that means that Blitzcrank is almost guaranteed to eventually hit a hook if he throws out enough of them. So again, that's kind of why he's there in Bronzodia. And to talk about the fifth member, who again doesn't really fit into the sort of above categories, is Shen. And Shen is a bit of an outlier, like I said before, but he does still have the reliable crowd control I talked about above. But the biggest thing here is that Shen shows off the importance of map awareness, again, for lower ranked players who are looking to improve. Especially, map awareness is something that's a little hard to figure out and a little hard to realize, you know, that there is more going on in the game outside of what you see on your screen, or more going on in the game outside of your lane in particular, right? And so while this does work against the Shen as well, right, the Shen player has to have the map awareness and the ability to say, I'm going to look at the rest of my team and press R on one of them. Even a single well-used Shen ult will just absolutely destroy players who aren't expecting it, because the awareness of global abilities, like I said, is super bad at lower ranks. And so, you know, because of that, no one expects the teleport play or the Shen or Karthus R, right? Like, no one is actually expecting these abilities to come into play or to do anything. And therefore, they're just completely flabbergasted when they do actually show up at the end of the day, right? They're like, oh my god, what do you mean that this Shen is going to be ulting me? Or what do you mean I barely survived that gank only to die to Karthus R anyways? And it's because they don't actually have the awareness to be like, yeah, there's a Karthus in the game, I have to play more defensively. Or there's a Shen in the game, you know, I have to make sure that, you know, Shen R is down before I go for any of those kind of plays. So there is sort of those abilities and sort of those things you can be looking at as why Shen is super powerful, because no one is expecting it. and therefore they can get high value almost routinely out of these abilities because no one is playing around the fact that their health bar is maybe, you know, a couple hundred points lower than it should be because of Karthus, or because that enemy champion actually isn't going to die because Shen will press R. And sort of all these traits combined make those champions very, very effective at lower ranks. I would still stand by that those those champions are still good at lower ranks because of the aforementioned tools they bring to the table. I know Bronzodia is sort of a dying trend. A lot of players